Well, I'll start by just, for those of you that don't know me and don't know about my kind of career, I thought I'd just kind of start you off. So I'm a Plymouth graduate. I did the MSc in hydrography, and I've now got 17 years experience in, a range of different kind of industry sectors, from kind of nautical cartography, where I started, through civil hydrography, ports and harbours, civil engineering, and then I've spent the last 10 years basically working for Fugro in kind of more offshore oil and gas and marine renewables. And I'm currently a hydrographic training program manager. So I'm responsible for the delivery of hydrographic training across Fugro, essentially. But I also have a lot of other hats as well. So I'm, as Paul said, a former Southwest Region Chairman. I'm on the board of directors for THS UK. I'm a project manager for the International Federation of Hydrographic Societies HPAS accreditation scheme, so the professional accreditation scheme. I was a member of the IHO Standards for Hydrographic Surveys Project Team, HSPT, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. And then moving forward, I've also been asked to join the Hydrographic Surveys Working Group, and we'll come more onto that later. So my talk's going to be on IHO S-44, or Special Order, or Special Publication 44. There's quite a wide range of knowledge within the audience. So, some of you will be very familiar with the document, and others of you won't really seen it at all. So basically in the end of 2020, in September, the new edition 6, was published by the IHO after a period of about 3 years of the project team kind of basically starting with edition 5 and then working through a process to produce this edition 6. So basically, this 6th edition is it's moving more towards being, a broader kind of a broader standard than we've had previously. So it's probably a bit more progressive than we've had before. 12 years have passed since the publication of S-44 edition 5, and there's been quite a lot of development actually over that time. So we've had advances in technology. The latest multi-beams can do a lot more kind of clever things. There's multi-pinging, there's kind of extra range, there's multiple heads, a lot more kind of technology there, really. And then there's also the emergence of new technologies and new techniques with kind of satellite-derived bathymetry and crowdsourced bathymetry. We've obviously got this shift now more towards autonomy as well, and we're not just talking about the actual vessels themselves. We're talking about autonomy in processing and reporting and deliverables. So quite a big kind of change and shift. Since the 5th edition as well, we've had a lot of additional standards as well. New standards under the IHO. So S100, this kind of universal hydrographic data standard, and then other bits and pieces underneath it. We've had things like S67, which is the Mariner's Guide to Accuracy of Depth Information, for electronic navigation charts, and bringing all these together and actually kind of cross-relating them so that they all work, in unison is, quite a big task. And that's kind of what, this edition 6 is kind of trying to do as well. Then we're looking at kind of, the survey data uncertainty, and then how it kind of maps out with product uncertainty. So looking at, data quality and data management and how that works. There's been some much more kind of global incentive as well, with initiatives like JEBCO 2030. So for those of you that don't know, there's this plan to map the world's oceans by 2030, and a number of different kind of government and industry kind of vessels and stuff have got involved and are basically submitting data, particularly from transit data. So, turning on the equipment whilst they're in transit between jobs, and then submitting it to the IHO and GEBCO for inclusion. And, we've all heard about this quite a lot as well. There's more emphasis on that ability to be able to collect the data once and get more value for money for it. So, have a lot more use cases. So because of the wide range of the audience, I'm just going to start from the start really and talk about standards. So what is a standard? What is it? What does it do? What does it achieve? It's basically a model, a set of rules used for comparison. We deal with them in everyday life. We have different formats. We have, like MP3 players that can play music. We have data formats in what we do. So, different multi-beam manufacturers have different formats, but each one of those kind of standards or formats basically has, set criteria. All the stuff that we do, we're interested in the science of measurement. So we're interested in SI units. We're interested in kind of, standards in the kind of manufacturing and the calibration of our instruments and stuff that we're using. So the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, defines a standard as a document basically established by consensus of subject matter experts and approved by a recognized body, that provides some kind of reference, some repeatability. It might be on the quality, the safety, and basically gives some idea of kind of confidence that what you're getting is what you've got essentially. So with regard to what we're trying to do, the basically the kind of governing body really, or the recognized body, is the IHO, and the IHO have asked a number of subject matter experts to get together and represent their kind of areas to produce kind of standards like S-44. So just as I alluded to at the start, there's this kind of growing kind of appreciation that perhaps the scope of hydrography isn't just about nautical charting now. In fact, the IHO have updated their kind of definition. There is still a focus on surface navigation and kind of navigation products, but it's now much wider in scope really. So the latest IHO definition is: hydrography is the branch of applied sciences which deals with the measurement and description of the physical features of the ocean, seas, coastal areas, lakes and rivers, as well as the prediction of their change over time. And the primary purpose is for the safety of navigation, but it's in support of all other activities, including economic development, security and defense, scientific research and environmental protection. So, a really wide scope really. And basically the kind of boundaries and stuff are changing, and we're seeing we're getting involved in much wider range of projects than you would do normally, or having kind of more input and using kind of applying our knowledge in other areas. So the context of this really is there's an international context. So a lot of the kind of the basis of this comes from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the IHO is recognized as the competent organization for hydrographic matters, and this is detailed in UNCLOS 1982. This took like a period of time for development, and the final kind of UNCLOS stuff wasn't kind of completely ratified and signed up till much later on. And then how this links is that the the International Maritime Organization is the United Nations kind of specialized agency with responsibility for the kind of safety and security of shipping and the prevention of marine and atmospheric pollution as well. And in 1989, as part of a resolution on the ships of routing measures, they stated that the minimum standards to which hydrographic surveys are to be conducted is to verify charted depths in traffic lanes and those defined in special publication number 44 of the IHO. So what is the IHO? It's an intergovernmental body that works to support the safety of navigation and protect the marine environment. It was established in 1921 and it coordinates the activities of the National Hydrographic Offices. Its principal aim is basically to ensure that all of the world seas, oceans and navigable waters are surveyed and charted. So its headquarters in Monaco, and it's right next to the harbour and the Grand Prix circuit. So some of us have been lucky enough to kind of visit and see it all for real. There are now 94 member state countries within the IHO. Lebanon was the last to join, basically in January 2021. And there are, 198 nations in the world. And basically, 48 of those are landlocked, but we're all dependent on the sea in some way, for shipping, for transport, goods and services, and basically as a source of food as well. So, protection of that environment, is critical to our survival, basically. But the IHO, in our standards kind of term, provides that kind of recognized body. So, what is Special Publication 44? Well, it's the only standard that deals with hydrographic surveys. So it is a minimum standard. It was mainly based on kind of, the development of kind of navigation products and surface navigation. So its criteria is still kind of based along those lines, but very definitely, in historical terms. And, S-44 is not a new kind of standard either, really. The IHO started looking at these kind of standards or kind of, accuracies basically associated with kind of depth measurement from kind of, 1957. So for quite a while, there was an international basically hydrographic conference then. And that was when kind of these kind of issues started being discussed, really. Some things that you've got to bear in mind when you're talking about S-44 is that, it's a standard, it's not a specification. So it kind of needs to be method and technology agnostic. So, not defining the equipment that we're using, but just setting the criteria to, what we need to achieve effectively. And previous standards weren't as good at being kind of technology or methodology agnostic. They were, you'd have kind of specific criteria in there that would name things like LiDAR, or you'd have some kind of line spacing kind of thing. So one of the things that was addressed in this new edition, hopefully, is that kind of tie to that kind of technology. One of the other big things as well is that you've got to bear in mind is that if we change the standard overnight, then it would, it's bad enough now. If we change the standard, it creates a lot of extra work for kind of, in these days, algorithms and all sorts of stuff within software and lots of other kind of automated processes. So we needed to ensure that kind of part of the standard was still backwards compatible, and that all the work that was done previously isn't suddenly out of date. And then a theme that we're going to come on later too is this kind of qualified hydrographic professionals as well. and whether the people that are doing the job have the right qualifications, have the right experience, and we're going to talk more about accreditation and how we bring it all together. So it's not basically a specification. So the use of S-44 should technically be kind of not used by the surveyors themselves, really. It's more being used by the kind of organizations, governments, industry that are kind of writing specifications. So, and using it as a basis for specification. And then, it comes into this kind of, the quality of the product is the result of this kind of chain of events. So we've got, the preparation, the planning, execution, how those things are kind of treated, and then finally the products. It's also worth mentioning at this point that the development of this standard is done by committee. So and I should probably reiterate that it's a minimum standard. So there's various viewpoints within a kind of that committee and those member states that are represented, and they can be kind of far and wide ranging. There's certain nations that have much more money, better equipment. So, as far as they're concerned, they would be better off having much higher stringent kind of standard. And, one, for instance, there's one nation that I'm not going to name, but, they would have you conduct all the surveys in their survey kind of area or waters to special order. Now, for other kind of developing nations, and that's perhaps not achievable. So you've got to bear in mind that it is this minimum standard, and it is developed as a committee process rather than one kind of direction. So yeah, when we're talking about this as well, we've got to think about the kind of hierarchy. So there is a kind of hierarchy of how things are. So there's our international standard. We've got IHO S-44. We're then next is our kind of survey specification. This one here is the UKHO one, the one that goes for all the MCA UKHO kind of civil hydrography programs, the specification used. And these are generally, a national level specification or client developed, basically. We've then got more specific kind of, we might have this kind of overarching specification, but then we need to know more specifics and more kind of localized information or extents. So that's where the kind of hydrographic instruction comes in. And then, in response to that, then the survey contractor needs to put together a procedure that enables them to meet that specification. So yeah. So the history of S-44, I'm just going to give you a kind of brief kind of overview, really. But the first edition was in 1968, and this was accuracy standards recommended for hydrographic surveys. What's quite interesting is if you read the kind of different chapters of this, there's quite a lot of links and to what you would see today. There's a chapter on depth, there's a chapter on positioning, there's a chapter on currents and water flow, that kind of stuff. So there is still this kind of logical kind of path of similarities between the different standards. So the next one was then in 1982, and this one changed its categorization a little bit, but it was it added this kind of deep sea soundings criteria. These are all, you've got to remember, are based on kind of single beam kind of surveys. So it's basically the accuracy with regard to single beam surveys, really. And then as things developed in 82, you had more kind of side scan survey, wire sweeping and that kind of stuff. And then as the standard developed, then it's obviously been led by technology. So the third edition was in 1987, and this is where we see our first references to kind of full seafloor coverage, and there's some references also to multi-beam and to side scan, and that, yeah. Then in 1998 was the fourth edition, and this was basically, it took it as being a kind of minimum standard now, and it was all about the quality of the survey data that the products are kind of based upon. There were some kind of developing technologies as well. You can see from the front cover, you've got LiDAR and that kind of stuff. But one of the kind of shortfalls was how do we kind of classify some of these other kind of emerging technologies, basically. So then the one that most of us are probably the most familiar with really in recent years is edition 5. There was quite a few changes in this one. There was an order 1B was added, which was to cover basically LiDAR data. So LiDAR data couldn't meet some of the density requirements of some of the other orders. So there needed to be some way to kind of utilize that kind of technology within the kind of charting kind of makeup. So it was brought in then. There was developing kind of some of the terminology. They dropped the term of using sound velocity, and it used speed of sound, and then there was much more of a move towards uncertainty rather than error. So in that we don't really know the error, but we can actually make a kind of statistical analysis and kind of quantify the uncertainty rather than an absolute error. So essentially the main trends in the standards development have basically been with regard to the increasing vessel drafts and adjusting the maximum allowable depths and allowable errors. It's evolved with technology as well. So, whether that be our positioning system, swapping from using kind of, range systems or terrestrial based systems to using kind of satellite positioning systems, and how that's affected our kind of horizontal positioning uncertainty. And the other kind of big shift as well has been, there's been this evolution from a single instrument absolute error, which if you read some of the specifications of some of the old instruments, and actually, if you read the 1968 version, it's quoting 0.3 of a meter vertical kind of accuracy. Now, I know that kind of there's some systems, even today that would struggle to meet that. So, obviously depending on what kind of depth of water and stuff you're working in. So yeah. So it's been quite an evolution really, but it's really interesting to see that you can still see those links back to the kind of original publication. So yeah, so moving on to what we've been up to as the kind of project team, then back in 2017, an IHO circular letter was put out, basically. Just for those of you that don't know, the IHO basically does all its announcements and communications in these circular letters. So it sends out basically letters to all the kind of member states and kind of nominated, industry experts and academia, and and asks for kind of basically help, or basically gives kind of acknowledgements and announcements and that kind of stuff. So the circular letter came out, and basically they were asked for kind of nominations for representatives to kind of join this Hydrographic Survey Standards project team. I will just point out that actually prior to the Hydrographic Survey Standards project team, there was a hydrographic survey scoping project team as well. So, and they concluded the conclusion of that kind of group was that there needed to be a Hydrographic Survey Standards project team. So it gets kind of quite, convoluted in these groups, and there's a difference between kind of project teams and working groups. So a project team is very much a kind of a temporary group, whereas a working group is a kind of fixed, permanent kind of entity. So anyway, under this circular letter, there were nominations received from 14 member states, Australia, Brazil, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Peru, Portugal, Korea or Republic of Korea, Sweden, Turkey, United Kingdom, and Chile. 2 observer observations, and one was FIG, and the other one was IFHS, or the International Federation of Hydrographic Societies. There was also some other stakeholders as well. So there was some representatives from Argons, from Fugro Lads, from Guardline, GeoSurvey from IIC, Precision Hydrographic Services, and the University of Southern Mississippi. So quite a mixture of kind of backgrounds and industry, really. In kind of the development process, there were kind of 4 main kind of pillars that basically, the whole development process kind of drew from. The first of which was, this was the terms of reference. Now, this was kind of, the terms of reference were drawn up in that kind of circular letter, and they define basically the scope of the kind of project team and who it's answerable to, and kind of what that kind of process is, and who it's made up of. And then there's other kind of, other IHO rules associated with that. In 2017, the second pillar, the HSPT basically devised a questionnaire. We did this at one of our first meetings, basically, and we devised a range of questions that were sent out to the hydrographic community to basically kind of, scope and give a feel for kind of what they think of the standard as it is, whether we need to make any adjustments, changes, and what their kind of thoughts on the future development was. I'll come on to each of these a bit more as we progress. The other third pillar was basically, once we'd consolidated basically all the kind of changes, we went through a whole process of various kind of different versions of the draft document, and we ended up in the summer of 2019 with a consolidated version, which we basically put out to all the IHO stakeholders and then got feedback from all of them. And then the fourth pillar is basically the expertise of the work of the hydrographic survey, project team, basically. So, and the work was kind of broken up into kind of different parts and different groups, and it was not just the meetings, it was kind of a lot of intersessional work as well. So pillar 1 then, the terms of reference. So the main kind of basis of it basically is to kind of review the existing edition of S-44, the 5th edition, and identify the deficiencies basically, and then following the review, work out a structure for kind of S-44, and look at the intention of basically bringing that together into a 6th edition. And then once the once that document was produced, then basically to work out whether a standing working group was needed. As I mentioned before, this was a temporary team. We were a project team rather than a working group. So the next step is a working group. And it's really strange to me, and it may be to some of you in the audience, but this is the IHO, this is the Hydrographic Organization, and it doesn't have a working group on hydrography really, or hydrographic surveys. So to me, this kind of is a no-brainer really, and something that probably should be there. So I'll come on to these in the future anyway. So as part of that kind of review process. At the first meeting, we came up with a list of limitations for the kind of 5th edition, but it was a bit more general than just the 5th edition as well. It was more about kind of, we took into account some of that kind of some of the feedback and stuff that members had got as well previously. So I'm just going to work my way through these. So basically, S-44 is mainly focused on the final objective, which is a nautical chart, really. With there's it's difficult to have an overview of all the requirements of the kind of survey as well, or the the standard requirements. There's kind of lots of other extra bits and pieces, like the positioning of navigation aids and currents and that kind of stuff, and all extra bits that are kind of, it's difficult to see all of them and to see whether you need to do all of them in order to basically meet the requirements. There was a limited number of definitions, and actually some of the definitions had kind of circular issues as well in their definition. So when you start talking about kind of full seabed search or coverage, or bottom types, and also there was the kind of issues with translation as well, and whether there was kind of enough understanding with those kind of different criteria. How do you define an object? And you look up what an object is and it says feature, and then you look at what features is and it says object. So you get these kind of circular references, and then obviously when that's translated then into other languages as well, it becomes even more difficult. So there's some work done on that kind of stuff. There's still a bit of a misalignment basically between S-44 and CATSOC. For those that don't know, CATSOC is a category of zones of confidence, and it's basically a way to show the kind of mariner or the end product user about the reliability or the kind of quality of the kind of data that they're looking at, basically, that's gone into the product that they're using. Something that a lot of the kind of other offices are using now is these kind of grid surfaces or bathymetric surfaces. Particularly in America, the BAG is kind of a common kind of survey deliverable. So it's basically kind of bringing these in and whether they're needed or whether they're not needed, or whether it's something that should be in the standard or not. So there's kind of a lot of discussion about that kind of stuff as well. There's still this confusion between a priori TPU and a posteriori. So whether you're kind of developing this total propagated uncertainty kind of before you're doing the job, or whether you're reviewing it with experience or after you've kind of done the job. So are the values in the standard a priori, or are they posteriori? So hopefully the new standard has kind of cleared up some of those kind of confusions as well. We've also already talked about this one. The S-44 should remain technology neutral. It's not about the specific kind of systems. It's not about the specific methodology. There are other guidance documents and stuff along those lines. There's been basically, there's a lot more kind of emphasis on kind of metadata and getting metadata right and the importance of metadata. So there's now, a dedicated chapter. Some of the chapters were kind of outdated and needed kind of rearranging. And there was a couple of annexes. So for the 5th edition, there was basically some parts on quality control and data processing that were in annexes A and B. And at that time, they basically thought that they would go into C13, and C13 would be, imminently getting some kind of update, but that never happened. So those annexes still, are in kind of the main standard. And actually, moving into the 6th edition, we still have some of those annexes hanging around. But one of the things that we'll come on to later is that, we're going to be moving towards this, basically this hydrographic survey working group, where one of the kind of objectives is to basically sort out C13. So the manual on hydrography. Right, so that's the limitations. So back to the questionnaire. So this pillar 2, basically it was, it was drawn up by HSPT, so the project team, and then it was disseminated by IFHS. I actually took the lead on this and basically, drew up the actual questionnaire and then, aided the kind of distribution. So we put it through all of our kind of member groups and all that kind of stuff. So the questionnaire ran from August to end of November in 2017. There's only 38 questions. We had 500 replies, but the results were statistically relevant. And actually, I was blown away by the scope of the responses. Actually, so I might have been a bit cheeky here, but I basically plotted the IP addresses of everyone that conducted the survey, basically. So yeah, so we ended up with this great distribution of where people are actually engaging in what we're doing and inputting into the kind of international standards. So it's a great international picture, really. It really shows how far and wide kind of our cause is, really. So just a few specific questions from the questionnaire. So we asked some questions about what documents do you use, what standards do you use, what documented standard do you use, and 54% use S-44, 22.4% use a standard more restrictive than S-44, but it was based on S-44. You've got 6.6% of the 500 replies use a standard based on S-44 but less restrictive, and then the vast majority of this other 14% we're using, they're actually quoting the more specifications than standards, so kind of either national level standards or industry basically standards. So things like the NOAA spec, like the LINS high spec and things like that. So yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and I was just going to say that so the vast majority of basically surveys undertaken are based on basically S-44, really. So another question from the questionnaire. Don't worry, I haven't got too many of these, so it's just a few kind of key ones. Is S-44 sufficiently strict? And this is something that you'll see develops kind of later on. But basically, you'll see that 53% think that yes, it's sufficiently strict, 28% don't know, and 18.5% think no. Then this was quite an interesting question. This was a question that kind of followed on from another question as well, basically. But this question was basically, should S-44 be extended to other purposes? And basically 60% consider that it should be kind of extended for other purposes, but quite a large proportion of them still think that focus should be on safety of navigation. So yeah. So coming to pillar 3, pillar 3 was the kind of consolidated version. So I just thought it'd be useful for you to see the kind of the way that kind of this process works, in that you basically have kind of the overarching kind of IHO group, the HSSC. I can't remember the kind of what the group is actually. It's gone out of my mind. But basically you have the kind of, this is the kind of survey standards committee, and then this is the kind of the international can't think. But basically you've got these main two bodies under the IHO. The kind of approval for kind of developing the new edition comes from them, and basically the reporting and everything goes to them. They're the ones that basically put out the that circular letter, to say we're looking for people to join this project team, this working group. Please nominate. And then, the project team or working group is formed, and then we have, these iterations of different basically versions of that kind of document, and there's this kind of feedback loop. The working group prepare it, then it goes through stakeholder feedback, then it goes back to the working group to prepare, to edit, to change, and basically you have this kind of circular kind of route, and then it goes back to the kind of IHO, to kind of to sort of get their seal of approval, and then it gets put out to kind of basically the IHO member states to see whether they agree or don't agree, and then obviously the next kind of version of that document is then published. So we'd been through quite from basically 2017, kind of March 2017, by the time we get to summer 2019, we've gone through a whole number of kind of different iterations. We were up to basically version 1.7 by then, and we basically got the HSSC kind of approval, and then it was basically put out to all the stakeholders. And then the big job then is basically, having a long enough period of time to kind of consolidate all those kind of comments and, all that kind of stuff. And, from member states, from industry, from academia, from, all over the place, basically, and then bring it all together and kind of produce the kind of final document, really. The project team then is the last kind of pillar. We had 5 meetings between June and March, and as you can see from the pictures, in some kind of very nice locations, actually. First one was in Paris. The next one was in Niterói in Brazil. Then we had Wollongong in Australia, and then Monaco, and the final one was in Sweden. And each, hosted by kind of one of the kind of members of the team, basically. The final project team was composed of 47 individuals, and everyone didn't go to every meeting, but there was a kind of what's the word, a kind of a large proportion that kind of had that continuity between the kind of different groups or the different meetings. So there were 30 member states represented, and I'll bring you back to that. There are 93 in the IHO, so I don't know how that compares with other groups, but to me that seemed a small amount, really. There were 14 different people from industry, and then there were 2 observers as well, so the ones that I'd already talked about, and there was one kind of IHO secretariat, which was David Wyatt, which some of you will know very well. So this is the kind of overview of the timeline, essentially. So we've got the creation of the project team, we've got the first meeting in Paris, then we put out the questionnaire. We then had our second meeting in Niterói, and we looked at the questionnaire, and we developed kind of the basically the first basis of the kind of drafts, really. So at the end of that second meeting, we had this kind of initial draft 1.0. There was quite a bit of intersessional work between the 2 meetings, and then we then had our third meeting in Wollongong. We then had this kind of consolidated version, so this 1.7 in September 2019, and then finally, we had our basically, by the time we met in Monaco, we were basically processing all of those stakeholder comments and and trying to basically bring together the final document. And then the last meeting, which was getting quite close to the mark in COVID terms as well, was in March 2020, the last meeting in Stockholm, which unfortunately I didn't make, but David Parker, who's on the call, was at the Stockholm meeting. So yeah, and I'm going to ask David to do a bit of a talk towards the end of this presentation as well, just because he's now agreed to become the chair of the Hydrographic Survey Working Group. so then basically the whole process, after we've done all the changes, all the updates, all the corrections, there was a call for endorsement. And, you know, through each of this, there was basically an ongoing work plan that gets updated at each meeting, and then they plan for what, you know, is going to happen in the next kind of meeting. So it's all quite, it was actually quite an efficient team, I think, and an efficient way of working. You know, the project team was led by Christoph Vringnort from Schom. He was the chair. So, but you know, each of us had our kind of, you know, what we were good at and the kind of bits that we kind of put into this. So, and then in July to September, there was a vote basically. And then in September 2020, we ended up with the actual publication. So and then the last thing is this Hydrographic Survey Working Group. So in the end, it was adopted by 45 member states. Basically, in order to get adoption, it needs approval by 30% of them. So on that basis, they would have needed, you know, 27 and a half member states. And in the end, you know, there was basically, you know, 48% instead. So quite a good turnout actually, really, for adoption. So there we have it. There's the circular letter that kind of, you know, went with it, and we ended up with this kind of the 6th edition in mid-September 2020. So 6th edition. Is there any questions at that point? Actually, it's probably worth just asking. No.
Is David White still there?
Yes. Yeah. At the moment, anyway. So right, 6th edition. What's new? So the big headline basically is that we added this new stricter order defined as the exclusive order. So, you know, you'll be aware that we've had, you know, we had order 2, we had order 1, order 1A, 1B, special order, and we've now got this exclusive order. And what's really interesting is that we didn't actually discuss this really in too much detail until the, you know, the penultimate meeting. So it was really a last minute kind of, you know, we need something else in the standard in order to kind of sell it a bit, almost, really. It wasn't quite like that, but, you know, it was kind of interesting that, you know, it came up at that point. So I'm going to talk about more on the exclusive order in a minute. There was basically this concept of bathymetric coverage. I'm gonna talk about that as well. Basically, special order explicit requires complete bathymetric coverage, and the orders, the specifications of the orders are divided into 2 tables now, and one is, you know, below, and the other one is above the vertical reference. There is also this, you know, additional thing in there now, which is looking to the wider scope, which is this basically beyond the safety of navigation. So this concept of a matrix of specifications. And it's probably worth mentioning that the whole of the project team was quite torn on this. You know, there were some of us that were really progressive and basically would have done away with, you know, kind of what had gone before, but gone completely matrix. And then there are obviously others that were kind of very conservative and, you know, liked what they had and you know, kind of would be happy with kind of, you know, something similar basically. So yeah, it was interesting to see kind of which nations and which kind of people had those kind of opinions. Kind of another development as well is the kind of vocabulary has been kind of aligned with kind of international metrology terms, so, you know, kind of measurement science terms basically. What we did, there's an interesting point on this one, is that actually we tried to make it completely kind of conversant with the metrology terms, but it actually made it unreadable from a kind of hydrographic point of view. You know, so you know, some of the things that we kind of talk about, our confidence intervals and that kind of stuff, didn't kind of translate as well when you basically kind of start using those kind of metrology terms. And there was some updates to things like positioning of coastlines and, you know, vertical positioning. And there was some other like additions, basically, you know, or some emphasis on kind of geodetic systems and that kind of stuff. And then the last, you know, there was some extra stuff on metadata as well. So there's a complete chapter on metadata. So yeah, so exclusive order, basically it's an order that is more, it's in areas where there's even more kind of, it's, you know, there needs to be even more kind of higher requirements, or, you know, more, what's the word? Yeah, so basically it's in order to meet kind of these underkill clearance, basically where maneuverability is kind of a key criteria, particularly in some of these kind of areas where you've got a long, you know, kind of port passage that, you know, if you've got a better idea of basically what those critical underclearance kind of depths are, then, you know, you can potentially kind of get more traffic through that kind of area in a safer manner, or you can load your vessels slightly kind of, you know, heavier, or in order. So basically the criteria is, you know, there for those kind of areas. So the criteria is kind of more stringent than special order. And, you know, when you talk to the kind of project team, there were quite a lot of groups anyway that already had this as part of their kind of, you know, their national standard anyway. They had, you know, they called it different things, you know, special order plus or exclusive order, or, you know, particularly in places like Canada and Sweden and the Baltic nations as well, they had, you know, this reliance on the kind of underkeel clearance. And also it goes hand in hand, as I said earlier, with kind of these other standards. So, you know, this S-102 and kind of, you know, having these high resolution underkeel clearance layers. So yeah, you'll see that, you know, we've got kind of similar things in our kind of table 1, as we all know it, or, you know, those of that know it. You know, just in comparison to special order, our depth total horizontal uncertainty, you know, special order is 2 meters. We're now talking 1 meter. Our depth total vertical uncertainty, you know, our A and B terms, our, you know, depth dependent error and our depth independent error are now reduced. You know, for special order they were kind of 0.025 and B remains the same. We're now talking about looking for cubic features less than half a meter rather than a meter. And then we've got feature search of 200%. So we're looking at basically, you know, complete redundancy in our feature search and complete redundancy in our bathymetric coverage as well. So the next thing was this term bathymetric coverage, and you know, this is an area where I think there'll be some, you know, some kind of work needed on the kind of education side and kind of the development of the standard in the future as well. Basically, bathymetric coverage is to kind of, it was introduced to kind of aid making the standard less technology dependent. So rather than having kind of line spacing or anything like that, this term bathymetric coverage was come up with. So, you know, the definition as the standard goes is the extent to which an area has been surveyed using the systematic method of measuring the depth. It's based on the combination of the survey pattern and the theoretical area of detection of the survey instrumentation. So it's basically about how you line plan and what the overlap of your kind of ensonification of your system is, basically. So the kind of guidance to, you know, whether you can meet it and whether you're not, you know, I think this will require some kind of future work, really. So in order to get around the, you know, what do you do on these surveys where they've got sparse line spacing or they're using single beam or that kind of stuff, then for order 2 and order 1B surveys, there's this value of 5%, and basically it was taken on this kind of basis of a, an average system with an 8-degree beam, and looking at the kind of line spacing basically. And there's, this calculation is included in the standard, so you can read about it. There are thoughts, yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the future anyway. So, we've got our standard kind of table 1. Something that's changed, which actually is quite confusing to me, is that the orders are now reversed. So we're now going order 2 to exclusive order. Those of us that are used to working with, edition 4 or edition 5 will know that they went the other way. We've still got our kind of criteria as we know them, though. We've got our depth total horizontal uncertainty. We've got our depth total vertical uncertainty, feature detection. We've got our feature search and this new term bathymetric coverage. It's worth noting that, in this table now, all the values are basically at the 95% confidence level. On previous ones, it spelt that out, but it was kind of basically it's a note at the top rather than being on the table itself. And then there's all these extra interesting codes as well that you'll see in the bottom corner of each one, and these are basically for the this specification matrix. So we've broken the criteria into different criteria. So these are all B's basically, and that's because they're associated with bathymetry really. And you'll see that later on there's some other kind of codes basically, but it's to do with how it all fits together essentially. We now have table 2 as well, which is uncertainty above chart datum. So we've changed some values in here. There's some additional parts in here. There's more of a distribution as well of kind of the values. So yeah, there's some extra bits, like there's a bit on angular measurements. There's a bit on kind of basically, yeah, water flow and speed. There's some quoted values for that now as well. Before it was in kind of free text, which isn't quite as easy to kind of visualize and see. Now you can basically look at the tables and see what the kind of requirements are. Then we come on to the specification matrix. So this is quite a kind of progressive leap, I think, and I think it's probably the way that the standard's going to go in the future. So, the thought behind this, actually, this started from the very start. So our first meeting, we basically talked about having this as the basis of the whole standard, but as I said to you before, there is quite a disparate kind of, people agreed, people didn't agree. It's quite a wide range of kind of viewpoints, basically. So what we did was we came up with essentially a compromise, and we had, our traditional kind of table 1 and the table 2 now, and then we had this kind of specification matrix. So what we did was we've got our different criteria. There's a number of different tables associated with this as well, depending on, kind of bottom quality, flow, water flow and that kind of stuff. And then we broke it up into a number of different kind of, levels, a scale essentially, and then we added in some values basically, or some sensible values that we thought would be appropriate. And then what we can do with this, we've still got back reference to our kind of our kind of standards as we know them, so we can still kind of look them up and we can still utilize them. So and there's a way of reading off the criteria across the top, the numbers versus the the letter row basically, and that's how it ties into the kind of main table 1 table. And the matrix basically provides it's more flexible. It can be utilized for other kind of survey activities, so kind of oil and gas, or you know, geophysical surveys, or the one I really want to try is with you know, high resolution subsurface vehicle, seeing whether, you know, I can utilize this for basically writing a specification for, you know, autonomous subsurface vehicles doing you know, pipeline inspection corridors or something like that, and see whether we can actually kind of use it for that kind of thing. And actually my hope was to have put something together along those lines for this talk, but you know, you just run out of time with everything that you're doing, really. So perhaps I'll do a future talk on, you know, how we've kind of developed and how we've moved forward with it and what we've done next. So yeah, so basically there's these different classifications of the kind of data, and you know, hopefully there can be different kind of realizations of the matrix. One of the other good things about this matrix is that I'll just go back to the matrix, is that you can use it after the fact as well. So it's not just priori, it's you know, basically with experience. So you can basically use it to quantify your survey after you've done it. So, you know, you could use it to, you could basically code it, and you know, it may be something that continues through into the metadata. So yeah, so there's these different kind of criteria. There's the bathymetry sort of class, there's the other positioning, there's water flow, there's nature of the bottom. So they're all in tables like this. So you've got a, you know, this range of quantifiable kind of different things. So, you know, we've got navigation aids here, we've got floating objects, coastline, you know, a whole load of different things, angular measurements, current, flow, direction, bottom classification. So I think it gives quite a wide scope. But obviously we're only limited by the kind of knowledge and the experience within the project team as well. So, you know, if we were to kind of grow this and, you know, make it more applicable to other areas of our industry, then we'd need to get kind of more, you know, industry buy-in and bring kind of those into kind of, you know, to help out, or to kind of, you know, ground truth or tweak and tune the model essentially. So just coming towards a close, really. You know, it's just a few items, kind of, they're under the kind of miscellaneous kind of category. So there's no invalidation of previous surveys, so they're still, you know, valid, basically. Something that we're going to kind of talk about a lot more is this kind of the importance of qualification and accreditation. And there was quite a lot of discussion about surveyors actually being part of the, you know, should we have a criteria in the matrix that basically says, you know, the level of experience of the surveyor, are they part of your kind of uncertainty budget or your, you know, moving forward? So yeah, I don't know, it's a question to ask, really. You know, there's plenty of people in our industry that basically have no kind of formal education qualifications that are very good at the job. So yeah, we'll talk about this when we talk about kind of accreditation anyway. So as I said before, we tried to align it as close as possible with the international vocabulary on meteorology, known as the VIM. So it's as close as we could get, that we could still maintain that kind of readability. Then there was a competition basically for the front cover, and it was won by Richard Powell at NOAA. I did talk about sending, you know, a picture that was drawn by my 5-year-old, but that didn't go down too well, really. So, and then for the first time ever, the project team were acknowledged. So there is a list of acknowledgements. So, you know, all the guilty parties at the back of the kind of document, really. So for the future, I'm actually going to hand over to David Parker, who's on the call. He's now become the kind of Hydrographic Surveys Working Group Chair, and has recently just kind of taken on that role and put together an agenda basically for the way things are going to work moving forward. So David, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Really good job just looking for the list of what we're going to talk about. Oh, you've got it there anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for that. It's done a good job of bringing some life to an otherwise fairly difficult thing to breathe life into, really. A document written over 3 years by a committee of around 50 people tells you all you need to know, really, in terms of the way things work and the way things turn out. Sometimes perhaps a much better document is written by 1 or 2 people, but what's important throughout the whole process is that everything was debated at length, and a consensus was agreed at every stage. And you would be amazed some of the things that we were all arguing about. Probably forgotten most of them. Anyway, so as Ian said, the working group has now, the project team has now finished its job. It was basically tasked with that one thing. But an agreement was reached through the HSSC of IHO, Hydrographic Surveys and Standards program, I think it is. I struggled with that as well, Ian, when you asked for a memory of what it was. Yeah. So they put out another circular letter, do we want to form this group? And it was agreed that the IHO, with all its working groups on basically around the sort of cartography and products side, to not have a working group focused on actual hydrographic data collection was a bit strange. So that working group was formed up as recently as February. Volunteers were asked to put their head above the parapet for leading it, a chair, a vice chair, and a secretary. And I foolishly put my hand up, and I will be chairing the group and working alongside Megan Greenaway from NOAA. We've agreed to basically co-chair it. The IHO weren't keen on us co-chairing, so we've called ourselves chair and vice chair, but our full intention from day one is to share that duty and work together as a team with a gent called Carlos, who I've not even met yet, from Portugal, who will be the secretary of the group. And still working alongside David Wyatt. He will be there as the sort of IHO ambassador until he retires, I think, at the end of September, in answer to Rick's question from about an hour ago. So on the screen now, I won't go through them all, but that's the sort of agenda that I've put together based on our original terms of reference, plus a few other things. So obviously, there's a requirement to do ongoing maintenance work. This is a permanent group now for the first time, so we need to program in some maintenance work on the standard based on feedback and how usage may change over time. Some of the group will get involved in specific translation work because that's still yet to be done. I think it's been translated into French only so far. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ian. Yeah, but you can imagine a really deeply technical standard translation is absolutely critical, and it needs to be done by somebody who's both very good at translating between those two specific languages, but also understands the subject. So that's quite a limited group of people. One of the other things that Ian already mentioned was the manual on hydrography, C13. I don't know how widely used it is, but one of the things we'll do is to find out how widely used it is and look at refreshing it and updating it, bringing it up to date. Some of it is very out of date. One of the other things Ian mentioned was the alignment with the CATSOX, or what's going to replace that in the S100 standard. So this is the data quality indicator that the mariner would use. There's still not a good alignment between the two. So one of the things I'd really like to do is to work with the data quality working group of the IHO, who define those quality indicators on charts and ENCs, etc., to try and see if we can get a cleaner and more obvious mapping across. We've already suggested some sort of quick fixes for that. And as well as that group, there's a requirement to liaise widely with all of the other groups. There are many of them. In fact, I've only just found out last week that I now have to attend a week's worth of online meetings in May with the IHO for this HSSC group, to basically, so that I, as the chair of this group, have got an eye on all the activity in their groups. So there's a full week of virtual meetings, which I'm incredibly excited about. One of the other things I've put on the list, our group so far is 52 members from 28 countries and around a dozen expert contributor groups, you know, such as IIC, Fugro, some other equipment providers, things like that. So it's a really big, diverse group, much like the last one. And inevitably, all these people will volunteer at the start, but some will fall by the wayside at certain stages. So it will be interesting to see who we've got there as that sort of core group. But all of those people will be involved in little niche areas of new technology, new approaches, and new best practice. So one of the things that it's nice for the group to do, and this happens already on a regional scale with the IHO, is to bring that to that sort of global forum. So basically, you've got all these experts on hydrography. Let's let them share some of their sort of best and new ideas in a carefully managed way, so that it doesn't become too promotional for certain, you know, companies or whatever it might be. Also, the IHO perhaps could do a better job of liaising with the sort of whole hydrographic sector, and really trying to expand use of the IHO standards more assertively, get them used outside of the surveying for nautical charting kind of sector. So I think they need to go out and do that work, and I feel that this working group will be part of that, if not the leaders of doing it, promoting the standards, promoting their use. As Ian's been talking about, all the different options that the matrix approach presents in the standard, it's kind of pretty infinite. So in absence of another sort of global standard, to try and encourage people to use it. And then one other thing, and this leads nicely into a talk that I'll be doing next month on our own hydrographic accreditation scheme. This is a blurry line between the International Board for Standards and Competence, who do accreditation typically for educational courses for the IHO and FIG. Well, they're also taking on the task now of this fairly new thing for them, which is individual accreditation of hydrographic professionals. I think there's a sort of blurry line between the hydrographic survey working group and what they're doing. And as Ian's already said, an absolutely key part of the overall machine and production line is the human. And I think personally that accreditation of the individual, rather than just the course that they did in isolation, is really critical to all of this fitting together. So I'm going to try and sort of squeeze that into the agenda as well. It's a big group with a big agenda, so I'm hoping to divide up into smaller groups who can go away. If there's a half a dozen people who are really fascinated on the C13 manual for hydrography, for example, it would be great to capitalize on their enthusiasm for it, and send them away as a sort of subgroup. And the same applies for all of it, really. It's a big agenda and a big group. So, you know, so that's the plan.